Well, hello. It's Miss Gina. And we're back again to read another chapter. This is story time with Miss Gina. I'll have to get me some darker markers. I've already used all my purple. Imagine that. I do like my purple. So this is story time and we're on chapter 3. That's right. We're on chapter 3. Chapter 3. 1 race card, 2 race cars, 3 race cars. Yellow, green, and red race cars. 3. T-H-R-E-E. 3. And we're reading an old book. I first read it when I was in 6th grade. It's been a minute. That was last week, right? Okay, so Mr. Hallam frowned as he cut himself a second slice of cake. Yum, cake. I like cake. I don't like the sound of your Mr. Putt. This certainly seems to be our day for mysteries. There just may be a connection. If the dollhouse is as unusual as I think, how do you mean? Mindy looked up from the tiny oilcloth-covered work table in her hand. Her father had taken it to school that morning in his attaché case. What's so mysterious about the kitchen table? He frowned. Well, first off, it's perfect. Right down to the worn patches on the oilcloth. Every blessed thing in the house is perfectly to scale. Mrs. Hallam started, but Mindy did not see what her father was leading up to. And so she prompted, "Don't you see, men? Dollhouse collections." Go about only one page. Usually have a few pieces of furniture, a picture or a mirror on the wall, a candlestick or lamp or something, out of scale. Too big or too small. To look quite right. Perhaps bought at a different time or place. Do you know what I mean? Mrs. Hallam spoke thoughtfully. You're right, and it is odd. There are the curtains, too. They're wrong. Mindy's eyes widened. Dollhouse curtains are always sort of stiff and bulgy. Is that what you mean? Her mother nodded, watching her husband as he answered, Yes, the weave is too coarse for them to hang in the sort of folds real curtains have. But why, Jack? What are you getting at? Mr. Hallam took the little table from Mindy to turn it over and point to the small little patch on the dark wood of its underside. At first, I thought it might simply be that everything in the house was made by the same man. That could explain the perfect scale, but it didn't seem very likely. Not all the china and glassware and metalwork, too. I took this piece into our science lab this morning because I wanted a look at the workmanship under strong magnification. He wanted to make it bigger so they could see it. He took a deep breath. It was still perfect. Nothing that looked like tool marks so far as I could see. On a crazy impulse, I took a very thin shaving from the wood. You can see the place and put it under the microscope and Mindy jiggled on the edge of her seat. Her hand bumped the carton that covered the house, taking up a good half of the table. Careful, her father cautioned. That thing may be worth a fortune. You see, he said almost reluctantly, either the little table isn't doll furniture or it's made from a kind of wood that doesn't exist. Mindy and her mother looked at him blankly. He grinned and ran his fingers through his hair. My reaction exactly. Yeah. Well, I can't explain it, but this little table is made of, well, I guess you'd call it miniature wood. But there's no such thing. Even bonsai, the Japanese miniature trees grow wood, cells of normal size. The grain in this table, sorry, my hair is all wackadoo. The grain in this table looks exactly like pine, but the cells are incredibly small. He drew a deep breath and said in a joking tone, now, unless the wood's from some exotic unknown tree, this was once a full-size kitchen table. Oh, Jack, and here I thought you were serious. Miss Hallam began to remove the dessert things from the table. I haven't had my legs so well pulled in ages. You mean real furniture shrunk? Mindy giggled. You're 2 months late for April Fools, Daddy. So I am. He laughed off his puzzlement with an effort. Riddles aside, this Mr. Putt of yours, who has an eye out for doll furniture, seems to be hanging around here like a fly around a honey pot. Pooh, there's no real honey pot. No honey here, Pooh. No honey there either. So that was kind of funny. So he's hanging around there like a fly around a honey pot. I don't like it at all. Of course, he said, he could have heard about the house from anyone who went to the Warnecke sale, but he must have an idea of its value to be making such a nuisance of himself. Why doesn't he just ask about it outright, Mindy said. Why should he be so sneaky? A hesitant knock rattled the screen door. Yoo-hoo! All three Hallams jumped. All three darted looks. Got a few more pages. Toward the carton-covered house, any visitors would think it was awkwardly large and very unlikely table decoration. Oh, Mrs. Bright, it's you. No, I mustn't come in, Mrs. Bright protested as Mr. Hallam rose. I hear my tea kettle whistling, and I must hurry back to it. I only thought you ought to know, Mr. Hallam. Mr. Hallam's eyebrows shot up in a comical fashion. Know that your tea kettle is whistling? Mrs. Bright laughed, a silvery ripple of amusement. Dear me, no. A worried frown came back. My hair keeps getting in my eyesight, in my line of vision. I'll find my place, sorry. A worried frown came back to wrinkle her forehead and make her look more than ever like an elderly pixie. It's that dreadful little man who tried to sell me a television aerial this afternoon. I told him I couldn't even afford a television set, but he would insist on climbing up on my roof. It put me in an awful tizzy. Now he's back and poking along your back hedge. I expect he's watching us this very minute. That does it, Mr. Hallam pushed his chair back from the table, furious. Nail, telephone Officer Beagle. I'll get Horace out of his pen and we'll settle this right now. Mindy, out of the way. Oh dear, Mrs. Bright ever sparkled as the Hallams scattered. Come on, let's watch. The sound of the big dog's deep bark, Mindy fondly called him Horse, as short for Horace, and crashing noises from the hedge were more than Mindy could resist. She pulled Mrs. Bright out and across the back garden. But when they were halfway, another sound caught the old lady's ear. Fudge! It's my tea kettle. It mustn't let it burn up, child. I burnt one up last week. She hurried away at a bustling bird-like run, calling back over her shoulder. Do come when it's over and tell me what happens. There's fresh chocolate layer cake for visitors. With a little ducking motion, she disappeared through a hole in the side hedge. Mindy stood undecided, tempted by the sound of her father's shouting, Horse's distant barking, and Officer Beagle's siren wailing down the highway. Brittlesdale's policeman so rarely had any cause to use the siren that when the least occasion presented itself, he overdid it and enjoyed himself immensely. But the other wail, Mrs. Bright's tea kettle, had reminded Mindy of the dollhouse. It needed watching too. She hurried back to the porch to stand guard over it with a golf club, feeling both faintly silly and considerably nervous. Mrs. Bright cut another slice of the rich, dark cake. It was Mindy's fourth, counting dessert at home, but Mrs. Bright's layer cakes were, Mindy felt sure, the best in the world. Where else did you find the layers of icing almost as thick as the layers of cake? Mindy went on with her story as she cut into the cake. So, he must have circled around the highway and his truck. Anyhow, he zoomed out of sight before the constable could get his car turned around. Excuse me. Horse almost had a fit. He was so excited. He barked himself hoarse. Oh, she giggled. Horse barked himself hoarse? Is that a pun? She took a large bite of cake. Cake sounds good. A play on words, perhaps, dear. But Mrs. Bright was only half listening. Such a very odd little man. She tilted her head to one side, a quizzical bird-like gesture. Do you know, he reminded me of a dreadful little person I knew when I was a girl. Wilhelm Kurtz. Dear me, I haven't thought of that name in years. He drove a team of grays in a splendid big wagon and sold patent medicines and marvelous cures for cancer and consumption and that sort of thing. All perfectly worthless, of course. She chuckled. The man wanted me to marry him. Can you imagine? She laughed to herself, remembering. How old were you? Asked Mindy, fascinated. Mrs. Bright took a sip of tea. Oh, 17 or 18, I suppose. But Mindy, my dear, your little man doesn't interest me, as does this dollhouse. You think he may be after. Setting her cup and saucer on the coffee table, she perched excitedly on the edge of her chair. Would the house have anything to do with the little pieces I saw in your front window this morning? The little settle and the washstand? I've been thinking about them all day. Yes, they're from the house. Did you like them? They're not for sale, you know, she added hastily. Oh, I wasn't thinking of buying, my dear. It's only that she paused. Remembering, it's only that when I was a girl, we had just such a settle in our house and a walnut washstand, too. The resemblances, well, ours were made by my great-grandfather, Buckle, and it occurred to me that he may have made miniatures of them, too. He had 6 daughters. And when they married and left home, one could have taken the dollhouse and the doll furniture and dollhouse. If my great-grandfather did make them, that is. Do you have any idea where your house came from originally? All we know is we found it at Warnecki's over beyond it's not Mousetown. That's Disney, sorry. It's Mousetown. Beyond Mousetown at a farm sale. Mrs. Bright was disappointed. No, none of our kin ever lived over Mousetown way. And I was so sure that pattern on the cushion on the little settle, it was faded, but it looked for all the world like one mama embroidered for our settle. And the brass handles on the washstand? Your great-grandfather must have been awfully good with his hands. Mindy ventured cautiously, remembering her father's doubts. Oh, yes, my grandpa, his only son, used to say he could do anything woodworking, blacksmithing, everything. And he had 7 children. Mindy looked around the tiny cottage. I thought you had always lived right here. But not here. Mrs. Bright laughed. Dear me, no. This was only the coach house in those days. After I married Mr. Bright, we remodeled it, and since we never had children, I never truly missed the big house. This little nest was just perfect. She smiled mistily, then recollecting herself and cut a tiny sliver more of cake. She's having some more cake. What did I miss? It's not what did I miss. What I did miss, sorry, makes the meaning different. What I did miss was the books, she said. Mama never could resist a book salesman, and so Papa had to build wide bookcases on each side of our front parlor door to hold all of the sets she bought. Dickens and Macaulay and George Eliot and ever so many. I always said I was going to read my way through them all, but I never made it past the second shelf, she sighed. Mindy found swallowing suddenly very difficult. The cake stuck in her throat as she remembered afternoon sunlight in a cheerful parlor, sunlight falling on. She coughed and managed to croak. Did the bookcases have glass doors? Why, yes, as I recall they did, dear. The old lady eyed her curiously. What is the matter, Mindy? Mindy took a deep breath to forestall the hiccup she felt coming. Whatever happened to the house? The house? Mrs. Bright faltered. She looked dimly perplexed and sounded almost evasive. Oh, the house was torn down years ago. It used to stand where your father's barn studio is now. Mindy persisted. Was it a stone house? Excuse me, my face itches too. And did you have an oriental carpet and a chandelier in your front parlor? Yes, we did, but why, child? Then your great-grandfather did make it. Mindy jumped up from the sofa, cracking her shin on the coffee table in the rush of excitement. He did make my house. It had to be his. Daddy put it in the workroom in the barn because the windows there are too high up for that Mr. Putt to peek in. Unless he gets up on your roof again. Please come. Very well, Mindy dear. Mrs. Bright clapped her hands together. I'll just fetch my sweater. Why, I declare this is like Christmas. She darted upstairs and in a moment was down again, swathed in a fluffy pink sweater decorated with orange flowers. My after dark sweater, she explained. My niece in California sent it, and I do love it because it's warm as toast, but it is a wee bit conspicuous. for daytime in Brittlesdale. Mindy was already out the door and flying down the flagstone walk. "I'll get the keys," she called. The new padlock on the barn door was stubborn. As Mindy jiggled the key back and forth, Mrs. Bright gave a little gasp of amusement. "Mindy, dear, how silly of us. Great-grandfather Buckle could hardly have made your house. He was dead ages before Papa built the bookcases or Mama embroidered that cushion. I wonder if Cousin Delmer could have made it. He was always carving little things, little baskets out of peach pits and that sort of thing." The padlock gave way at last. There, Mindy let Miss Bright go in first, then relocked the door with the bolt on the inside. The house sat under a card table in the middle of the room in a pool of light from the street lamp outside the high windows. The card table was my idea, Mindy explained as she pulled it away. So Mr. Putt couldn't see the house even if he got up to the windows with a ladder. It just fit. If I can find the pull string, we can have some more light. She groped for the string, all the while watching Mrs. Bright expectantly. "Oh, Lord," said Mrs. Bright, very faintly indeed. "Dear me, it is our house. It is, it is, it is." She bent over, then got down on her knees in the pool of light to peer in the upstairs windows. It was too dark inside to see anything but the fan light over the front door. The knocker and the doorknob itself drew her fluttering fingers. "Look at this, Mindy," she whispered. "This is the bee on the doorknob that Great-Grandfather Buckle made." Mrs. Bright touched the doorknob with a hesitant finger. As she did, Mindy felt a strange, painful ringing in her ears. She clapped her hands over them and squeezed her eyes tightly shut. But the ringing sound grew still louder. She did not actually see what happened, but it felt as if the barn had exploded outward. She found herself flat on her back under her father's heavy workbench in a rushing wind. There was the sound of falling debris on all sides. She huddled under the bench. It was quiet again in a minute. When Mindy sat up and opened her eyes, there was Mrs. Bright, rigid with amazement, kneeling in the twilight on the front step of her old home. Both hands gripping the doorknob marked B. Very slowly she pulled herself up and very slowly turned the knob. The door swung open. "Won't you come in, Mindy dear?" Her voice quivered. Somewhere off to the side of the house, a timber from the Hallam barn groaned and toppled with a crash. Mindy's knees felt like water, but she stood and followed. And that was the end of chapter 3. We are finished with chapter 3. So, we need a 4. We'll be on chapter 4 next time. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 trucks. Yellow, red, green, and purple. So that's where we're going to leave you. Next time, we'll be on chapter 4. Can't wait. All right, grow your brains. Read more in 2024. You've been at Miss Gina's Planet, and I'm Miss Gina. And next time we'll read more. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.